Hi, everybody, and welcome to Exegetically Speaking, a podcast of the friends and faculty of Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois. My name is David Capes, and I'm the Senior Research Fellow at the Linear Theological Library, and I'm former Dean in the School of Biblical Theological Studies at Wheaton College. Our purpose in these podcasts is fairly simple. We want to promote the study of biblical languages, Greek, Hebrew, Aramaic, so we can read the Bible more faithfully, study it more fully, and not just read it and study it, but also to live by it. Joining me today is Dr. Adam Miglio, who's Associate Professor of Archaeology at Wheaton College. Adam, thanks for being a part of this conversation.
Glad to be with you, David.
Now, we are together in the COVID era, which means that we have 1,100 miles separating us, and we're doing this by a computer instead of being in a proper studio. But I'm glad that we've taken this time to be a part of this.
Me too.
Now, we're going to talk a little bit about strategic ambiguity in the Hebrew Bible or in Hebrew narrative. So that sounds pretty fancy and pretty academic. What does that mean exactly, strategic ambiguity?
Sure. I think that the best way to describe it is perhaps with a venue that's one we encounter it in all the time, and that's politics. I think it's most familiar to us as a rhetorical device in politics. In the political season that's ramping up, and really in all political seasons, politicians love to trade in strategic ambiguity, where they'll vaguely gesture towards something maybe uplifting and positive, while simultaneously avoiding saying anything substantive. And politicians love to do this, right? They want their words to remain open to as many interpretations as possible. And in the democracy in which we live, this openness is a means then to try to be all things to all people.
And then what you find is that, then the pundits and they get on the news stations and talk about all the different possibilities of what that means, right? They do an exegesis of those particular words.
Absolutely. In the Hebrew Bible, of course, unlike politics, I don't think strategic ambiguity is intended to trick or deceive us, but it's a device that is intentional that I think is supposed to give the reader pause. You can think of it as a speed bump, so to speak. It causes the reader to slow down so that she will stop and ask, boy, I wonder what the text means by that. I could imagine 2, maybe 3 different possible interpretations. And I think that that's a helpful device for us. It is in slowing down that the reader begins to ask important questions that the narrative hopes to answer or come back to. Yeah. And so it's setting us up, teeing us up to understand the text better.
And one of the things about reading the Bible in the original languages, for me, I don't know about for you, is that it does slow me down. If I'm reading it in English, in the New Revised Standard Version or the New International Version, whatever, I can rip along pretty quickly, and I don't have to think about it much. But when I go to the Hebrew or the Greek or whatever it is, it causes me to slow down. But this is something in the text itself that makes you slow down. Say, well, there's a couple of possibilities.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's that slowing down that makes us better readers, as you say.
Yeah. You want to look at Genesis 4? Is that where it is?
Yeah.
Genesis 4.
I think so. Genesis 4. Of course, this is the first narrative for us east of Eden. After the man and the woman have been expelled, we have the story of Cain and Abel. And this story, of course, has lots of important details in it, but I think for our purposes, I'd like to look at what we might describe as morphological ambiguity, that is the word itself, and we'll come to this in Genesis 4:7 in just a second, is ambiguous in its form, and it's also, therefore, and we'll see here in just a second, ambiguous in its meaning. And this is really important for signposting for us some of the key possibilities, and really, I think, sharpening our attention to some key ideas here in this first story after the Edenic one. The verse really I want to focus on is Genesis 4:7. I'll just read a translation of it, or perhaps I could read it in Hebrew as well. How about that?
Yeah.
Halo titiv se'et, ve'im lo titiv l'patah chatat rovetz, ve'elecha teshukato va'ata, and this is the key phrase, tim shol bo. In English, of course, a rendering might sound something like, if you exhibit goodness, speaking to Cain, God says, there will be recognition. But if you do not exhibit goodness, sin is a crouching predator at your door.
Mm.
Its appetite is for you. Now, you should take charge of it. You should take charge of it. That's the phrase that I think is really interesting here and strategically ambiguous.
Mm. Mm. Well, tell us a little bit about that, because I mean, this is the first time the word sin occurs in the Bible, right?
That may well be. That's interesting. Probably. Yeah,
I think it's the first time, and I've had debates with rabbis over the fact that, well, what happens in the Garden of Eden is never called by the Bible a sin. So it wasn't wrong. It was anyway. That's a whole nother conversation. But this sin is sort of is crouching. What word did you use at the door?
Yeah, sin is a crouching predator. I actually think this is a good metaphor here. Hatat rotsev is a participle that looks to me like it's a nice metaphor. Sin is a rotsev.
Yeah.
A crouching thing, which is, I think, an animal.
Okay, crouching thing. And its appetite, I like that. I've seen the word desire for you, but I like this notion of appetite as well. And,
this is lexically connected with some of those ideas in the Garden of Eden, this word, tishukoto.
So where's the ambiguity, and where's the sort of the field of understanding here? Yeah,
so the ambiguity here, I think, is bound up, at least in part, with this phrase and the verb timsho bo, you will rule over it, or you shall rule over it. It could be understood in two possible ways. That is, in Hebrew, it could be understood simply as, first, a prediction. You will, Cain, eventually rule over it. Alternately, it could be understood as a charge. You must rule over it. And at this point in the narrative, I think the reader's going to have to stop and ask the question, is God telling us what's going to happen? Or is he charging Cain to take responsibility for what happens? Of course, we're going to get the answer to that as we come through to the end of the narrative. But at this point, it's wonderfully ambiguous. And when we do get to the end of the narrative, that ambiguity, of course, being resolved, Cain was being charged to rule over sin. We come to realize, and it's focused our attention as readers on the fact that Cain, very much like the first man and woman, were offered this choice between life and death. And for the first time, if sin first appears here, so too death appears for the first time in the Cain and Abel narrative. Maybe conspicuously in part because, of course, the threat in the garden was that the day you eat of it, you shall assuredly die. And this becomes in many ways a fulfillment, I think, of that punishment. But at the end of this story, then, the ambiguity being resolved, the fact that Cain is in fact being told to rule over it, I think we're being set up to look at life east of Eden and to realize that this choice between life and death is going to be recurrent. It's not just one that was set up in the garden, but that's set up after the garden, east of Eden.
So is this like one of the first commandments, if you will? I mean, could you look at it that way? I mean, before the 10 Commandments, before the law, covenants, and codes and such.
It is very much, at least to me, the whole thing smacks or has overtures of wisdom literature. Right? You're being told to do the two ways teaching, right, that you find throughout the Old Testament. And maybe that choice between life and death, we could pick up and trace through. Moses is going to say, I set before you life and death. Jesus is going to take his cue from Moses and maybe from Cain and Abel and say to us, there's a narrow gate that leads to life and a broad gate that leads to perdition. And so I think this becomes a theme that you see working its way through, and that it's the first story east of Eden, that ambiguity exists. I think it exists because it wants us to slow down and not miss the fact that this choice is important to be aware of.
Great word, Adam. Thank you, Doctor. We so much appreciate you being a part of the conversation. Thanks as well to Silvio Vasquez, Rebecca Larson, and Krista Sanchez for helping us edit and produce this podcast. Thanks to Phil Kagi for our music. If you want to study biblical languages, then the best place for that is Wheaton College. Got a great program there, so go to the website, www.wheaton.edu. Look for modern and classical languages. Start there, or you can be looking for graduate work. Go to the Master of Arts in Biblical Exegesis. If you have questions about the podcast, we'd love to hear from you. Go to exegetically.speaking@wheaton.edu. Send us an email. That's exegetically.speaking@wheaton.edu. Thanks for listening.